Hi, I'm Dena Smith. I'm on the worship team here at PIUCC. Now, I feel like we all probably have that cartoon we watched when we were actually way too young to watch that cartoon, but our folks let us because it's a cartoon, right? And see, I'm a child of the 80s, so there are actually quite a few for me to choose from. The one that I would say elicited the most complex emotions for me that I certainly didn't have the framework for, loss and pain and melancholy, was the 1982 commercial flop but master cult classic, The Last Unicorn. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, well, it really is not your average children's movie. It's haunting, it's poetic, it's remarkably unsettling, it's allegorical, and it's absolutely unforgettable. In any case, the story follows the journey of a unicorn named Amalthea on a quest to rescue the rest of her kind. She is joined by a hapless magician named Schmendrick and later a cynical, middle-aged woman named Molly Grew. Amalthea and Molly Grew were powerfully written characters, even for tweens like me, long before I could grasp the kind of frenemy bonds that could really form between women. Their first meeting is one of the most emotionally charged in the entire film, and it's Molly who gives us its heart. Her words catch somewhere between grief and fury. When she first sees the unicorn, she rasps, "No, it can't be. Can it be? Where have you been? Where have you been? Damn you, where have you been?" In the book, it's described as scolding her as though she were a strayed milk cow. "I am here now," was the unicorn's response. Molly, however, scoffed, "And where were you 20 years ago, 10 years ago? Where were you when I was new, when I was one of those innocent young maidens you come to? How dare you? How dare you come to me now when I am like this?" In this scene, you can feel the emotion, but what is it? It's hard to name, but I think it's the ache when the past and the present collide too late. We don't need to know what Molly would have done had the unicorn come when she was younger because we already do know. We know that feeling. The ache of delayed grace, the haunting thought, if I only knew then what I know now. Scripture gives us a glimpse of someone who's lived with that ache for nearly 4 decades. Our text today introduces a nameless man who has been lying near the healing ponds of Beth-zatha by the sheep gate for 38 years. Jesus, whose own age at this point is at most 33, seeks him out, moved by the sheer length of his waiting. He asks, "Do you want to be made well?" And the man replies, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." That word "sir" is Kyrie in Greek, the same word the disciples used to mean Lord. But in this case, it's not reverent, it's just respectful. He is not asking for a miracle. He is simply explaining why healing keeps passing him by. He is someone who has spent a lifetime on the ground in a place called the House of Mercy, beside a gate once used to bring sheep to sacrifice at the altar, a few yards away from waters that could have healed him if this was a world where the least were not forced to compete for every scrap of compassion. Someone laid him down on that mat and never came back. And now, 38 years later, Jesus stands before him. Come on now, Kyrie. Can you make us well from that? From the constant knowledge that there are some who are able to walk freely and others left behind as symbols. That some are carried in to be healed and others carried in as though to be sacrificed. Now Jesus heals his malady, tells him to take up his mat and walk, and the man does. Many scholars point out that he doesn't ask to be healed, nor does he offer any sort of thanks or declare belief. In fact, the very next verse tells us he is stopped by the authorities for carrying his mat on the Sabbath. No sooner is he finally able to roll up his mat and move than the system that has ignored him for 38 years tells him, no, you can't do that here, not like that, not right now. Now, you'll notice the authorities weren't there when he was being stepped over by the more able-bodied individuals at the pools. Empathy didn't move them, but power in the moment certainly did. They wind up asking him who healed him, and he answers honestly, I don't know. But later Jesus finds him again in the temple, not to welcome him, but to warn him, do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may happen to you. And it's a hard line. What could be worse than nearly 4 decades of paralysis and abandonment? But I like to believe this wasn't Jesus scolding. I like to believe it was him realizing right there in real time, if the world doesn't change, this man can fall again. Because you can heal someone's legs, but if they walk into a world with no protection, no dignity, no place to belong, they are still at risk of being broken by the very system that left them behind in the first place. And we as a society still do this. We build the pool, but we don't build the ramp to the pool. We build the shelter, but we forget the support. One example I think of is a transitional housing complex called Argyle Gardens that was built a few years ago in Portland, Oregon. It was meant to be a model of dignity for people transitioning out of homelessness. It was beautifully designed, had award-winning architecture. Inside there was accent walls, quality furniture, shared common spaces, an environment meant to build community and feel like home. But within a year, the elevator broke and case management stopped showing up. Tensions escalated, arguments broke out among the tenants. And the people who built it, the owners, the funders, the taxpayers began to ask, why aren't they treating this place better? And as one manager put it, just because someone is in crisis doesn't mean they're going to be a good tenant. To which I would add, yes, and they still want to be made well. This isn't just a policy failure, it's a pattern. A pattern we've seen in housing, in healthcare, in support services, even in how we carry grief. Because we expect people to rise after crisis, but we rarely ask if we've given them anything to rise into. And it's not just true for tenants in transitional housing. It's true for the families we honor every year on the last Monday in May. We call their loss sacrifice or service, but we rarely call it what it actually is: hope that gave way to grief. As a quick visual, in the military tradition, families with a loved one serving display a blue star in their window. If that loved one dies in service, the blue star is replaced with a gold star symbolizing the ultimate sacrifice. When I went to college in Waterloo, Iowa, one of the most famous World War II Gold Star families were from there, the Sullivans. Some of you may remember the one-hit wonder from the early 2000s called Sullivan, which helped bring their story back into the spotlight. It's a fictionalized song written in the voice of someone addressing their mother, Mrs. Sullivan, first encouraging her to hang her blue stars in the window, and then later sorrowfully saying, "We regret to inform you that your sons have passed away, all 5. So change your blue stars to gold." The real-life Sullivan brothers, George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert, had insisted on enlisting together after Pearl Harbor. As a matter of fact, they each wrote on their enlistment forms, "We stick together." In a letter to their parents, one of them added, "We'll make a team that can't be beat." And all 5 died when the USS Juneau was sunk in November of 1942. When I was in college, 60 years later, the town of Waterloo still remembered them, with parks, streets, even a convention center named in their honor. And their mother, Alida Sullivan, became a local and national figure, touring the country to speak and raise war bonds, determined to build something from the wreckage. For a military family, a gold star is considered the highest honor, but no family would call that the goal. Alida saw that, she understood it, and she bore it well. She was a classic steward of the gold star. But no one No one, absolutely no one, would read her story or hear her speak and think this was what she had hoped for. What is honored is not always what is desired. So which one counts as being made well? It doesn't help that as a nation we've struggled to hold powerful emotions, hope, grief, honor, without turning them into ways to draw lines in the sand. Take May 1st, 1865, just weeks after the Civil War ended. A group of formerly enslaved people in Charleston, South Carolina, reburied Union soldiers who had been dumped in a mass grave behind a racetrack. They exhumed the bodies, they gave them individual graves, and then together with school children, missionaries, and teachers, they held a memorial. A crowd of 10,000 gathered. The children walked in procession around the burial ground, placing flowers on each grave. They sang the national anthem. They sang hymns. They offered prayers. One journalist described it as a procession of friends and mourners such as South Carolina or the United States has never seen before. And yet for over a century, that act of remembrance, led by those most harmed by the systems surrounding the war, was largely forgotten. It wasn't included in mainstream histories, it wasn't taught, it wasn't named. Even the graves were later paved over as though the act of grief had never happened at all. It wasn't until the 1990s that historian David Blight came across a forgotten newspaper account in an uncatalogued archive box at Harvard and brought the story back into the light. However, meanwhile, just 1 year after that Charleston procession in Waterloo, New York, businesses closed to allow residents to place flowers and flags on the graves of Union soldiers. This is the observance that the U.S. government later recognized as the official origin of Memorial Day. There were other local commemorations, but in those early years, the key word was still local. Decoration Day services remained divided. Confederate losses grieved in one place, Union dead honored in another. It wasn't until the World Wars that the rituals really began to unify. And even then, this was not out of some sort of broad stroke of enlightenment, but because we finally found ourselves all on the same side of the net. So what would we say if asked whether we want our nation to be well? Alida Sullivan, however one might feel about her methods, worked tirelessly. She did not want the nation made well by the virtue of gold stars. She wanted a nation where blue stars would come home and never hang in the window again. Now, stepping back from military imagery, I'm reminded of Irma Bombeck's essay, If I Had My Life to Live Over, written shortly after her cancer diagnosis. The one line that really stays with me is, if I had my life to live over, I would have burned the pink candle sculpted like a rose before it melted in storage. These words were written by a woman who had lived a full and successful life and yet still knew grief and regret and the ache of waiting too long. But how easy it would be to read those words and hand her another candle as though that would fix it. Here, a candle, now go into the world with no more regret. Here's an apartment, now go live with hope and purpose. Take up your mat and walk. The man who was healed by the pools ended up approaching the authorities and telling them it was Jesus who healed him. It was another step towards the story that would lead to the cross. And then he disappears. He likely kept walking, mat in hand, staying out of sight until the Sabbath ended, and then what? Try to find his family that abandoned him a generation ago, maybe try to learn a trade or start a new life. Jesus had told him, do not sin anymore so that nothing worse may happen to you. And then he watched him walk away into a world with a new body, but with the same broken systems. Because miracles, even resurrection without transformation, are just one more thing the world can celebrate briefly, then quietly suppress. The man at the pool wasn't a perfect tenant. He didn't offer gratitude. He didn't offer belief. He just picked up his mat and walked into a world that wasn't ready for him to be whole. And we know the truth. There is no easy answer. There's no easy fix for the housing crisis, no clear solution to trauma or to grief. There's also no clear triumphant ending to war, only the slow and aching work of trying to make peace mean something. But if we're all waiting until everyone is ready and polite and grateful before we show compassion, we'll be waiting for another generation. Jesus told him to take up his mat, and in a world so indifferent, the miracle was almost the easy part. Because healing without welcome, without transformation, without protection is just another story lost in the crowd. We are the stewards of miracles, called not just to witness healing, but to make space for it, to prepare a world where it can last. And so go. Build the ramp and not just the pool. Burn the candle. Carry the mat. And don't let anyone tell you that grace only belongs to the perfect. Even if your unicorn comes late, even if healing arrives in the wrong season, grace is still grace, and it is worthy of welcome. We honor the sacrifice of blue stars to gold and continue the work, hoping one day for windows to be left unadorned. We are the stewards of miracles. Let's live as though we expect them to grow.